Welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. Today, we have a special occasion where we have two guest authors who will be in conversation with each other. So Kate Gale and Adam Kirsch, I just want to welcome you to the stage, and I will let you introduce yourselves and share your work and then begin a discussion. And I will be here on hand if my services are needed or at any point. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to hear this myself, and everyone enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Kate.
Hi. Well, it's great to be here with you, Adam. And,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting to see your book, The Discarded Life, coming out. For those of you who have not seen Adam's book, you can see it on a lot of online places, including, I think, Barnes & Noble online, obviously Amazon, but a lot of other places as well, and it will soon be out.
Yes, I'm excited. Kate is my publisher and editor at Red Hen Press and the author of her book, which is out now. And I think the link is on there, The Loneliest Girl.
So I will just start by saying that before I met Adam, I met Adam's father, who's also quite a well-known writer. Some of you may have heard of, but you would have heard of if you were part of the literary scene in Los Angeles. Adam's father, Jonathan Kirsch, is also a writer. And so it was just like, at some point I was in New York and I came across Adam's name writing on some big topic. And I was like, wait a minute, there's two Kirsches. I bet these two guys are related. And so I started looking at Adam's writing and following what he was writing in New York. And so maybe, Adam, I've got one question for you, not necessarily about being part of a literary family. I'm not going to torture you with that. When we're having drinks, I'll ask you about that. But I'm kind of curious because I have my own struggles, let's say, with doing many things like working at a press and doing a little teaching. I'm right now at Chapman University. I'm teaching an evening class here, so I had to come down early to do this. So I also feel like I wear a lot of hats, and then finding time to be in a creative space is always kind of a challenge, because I find myself that I'm not the kind of person that just is writing poetry when I'm on public transportation, maybe partly because there isn't any in California, but or not very much.
There's the subway now. There's the light rail.
Yeah, there's a little bit of subway, but not. I mean, it took me an hour and a half to drive here to Chapman, and during that time, I didn't write any poems. So most of the time, we're driving, and so basically, but for me, writing poetry is a sort of sacred thing. It's something you do when you don't have any noise in your life, and there is a great deal of noise in a lot of my life, and so finding that sort of sacred time is sort of a bit of a challenge, because I don't believe that I write best in noise. And so I'm kind of curious for yourself, because you also have a rigorously intellectual life, whether your creative work just kind of hinges into that intellectual life, or if those two things are separate ideas, separate things.
That's a good question. I mean, I think there are some people who write poetry all the time or on a regular schedule. They're always working on something. But I think that anyone who writes poetry also is doing other things, because no one is doing just poetry, because you have to make a living, and no one makes a living writing poetry. A lot of people teach and write poetry, but that's also a full-time job. So you have to think about how you're going to fit your writing in. I'm a newspaper editor. I work at the Wall Street Journal as an editor. So I have a full-time 9-to-5 job, and also do some other kinds of writing about books or about history. So I don't write poetry all the time. The way it has worked for me is that I'll sort of have an idea, sort of a theme or a subject that I think I want to write about in a book, and I'll sort of turn it over in my mind for years. And then at a certain point, something will sort of click, and I'll start writing and try to keep writing until I feel like I finished with it. So for each of this will be my fourth book, The Discarded Life, and fourth book of poems. Each of them The last three have been written in about a year and a half. So that means there have been 5 or 6 years in between when I wasn't really writing poetry. So I feel like that's how it works for me, is that I'll sort of turn to it and then put it on the shelf for a while and then come back to it. But what about you? What's your writing schedule like? Do you have a particular space that you write in, or a place that you go?
I tend to write on weekends, and so I also like, my last book was out in 2014, so that was also quite a while ago. And I also am a big believer in the whole idea of working on something for a while and then putting it aside and looking at it with fresh eyes. When I've first written something, I'm quite impressed with myself.
Right.
Okay, you are my hero. Look at you go. And then usually a month or so later, I'm kind of surprised at that sort of thing that I wrote. And so it takes me some time to do some editing. And I think that's also partly because, like you, I am doing a lot of other things at the same time. But I also really like to have a big idea that I'm working on. So I think that some poets are sort of writing what I would think of as sort of more occasional poems, like they're kind of coming up with them. Each poem is a fresh idea, but mine are all fitting toward some sort of master plan. And so I think yours definitely are, when I've looked at yours. Some people call that writing a project book, but I really think of something that is really a project book as being like the Hubble telescope book that Tracy K. Smith wrote. That feels to me like a real, like, everything moved toward a certain idea. I don't think of myself as doing that, but I have a plan that I'm working on, which means that some poems could get kicked off the island at the end.
Right.
So basically, I'm not writing during the week unless I took a week to go do that. I did, for the first time in my life, decide to apply to a writer's colony. I don't know if you've ever done this, Adam.
No, I never have.
I had always, when I looked at the back in people's books, I would see that they had gone to writers' colonies. And then I would call a friend of mine and I would say, God damn it, look at this. Brenda Shaughnessy off to another writer's colony. And then one time a friend of mine was saying to me, you do know that the way she got to go to this is she applied. And I said, that could be a point. And then I said, they would never take me. And then she's like, well, you'll never know because you never have tried. It's kind of like winning the lottery. You keep thinking you'll never win the lottery, but you've never bought any tickets.
Right.
So then I thought, well, I'm going to try for a super cheesy one that if they turn me down, then that will confirm what I've always believed, that I'm never going to get into any of these. And they accepted me. So it was very shocking. Anyway, so I'm going to go off to that. It's such a cheesy little writing colony, though, that you have to pay to go and you have to bring your own food, which is good for me because I am a very skinny little person and I hardly eat anything. I like to bring my own food places. So I can just bring my own tuna.
Where is it that you're going to be going?
I'm going to Dorland.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so it's in California, too. I don't even have to leave California. I can just bring my own tuna salad and just eat that every day there.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm super pleased because I can write during the week there.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, I do think that writing time is quite precious for those of us who are doing full-time jobs. I think when you teach, it's a little easier, right, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the writer colony schedule is for people who can take a sabbatical or who have the summer off. If you have a job where you're there all the time, you can't really say, I'm taking the next month off to go be at a writer's colony. And of course, if you have family responsibilities and all kinds of other things that make it difficult to do that. And in a way, I feel like it would be a lot of pressure because then when you were there, you'd feel like, oh, this is it. I got to get all the work done now.
I know. I don't know how weird that will feel. Yeah, when my kids were growing up, I always knew I didn't have the time to do it anyway. But anyway, this will be my first try. I'll have to see how it goes. But I will be there at Dorland with my tuna. But I do think that that I have talked with other writers, though, that sometimes they were given an opportunity to, like, someone said to them, I'd like to invite you to come and stay at my house for a couple weeks to write. Mm-hmm. And then they'll call me up and say, I don't know what to do. And I go, say yes, say thank you.
Right.
You know, get together a little hostess gift, make some cupcakes and go, because having time to write is quite precious for many of us. Again, if you teach, you might get a sabbatical and you might get, as you say, the summer off. But like, as someone who works full time in publishing, as you work full time, Adam, I have written many, many letters over the years to help people get a sabbatical.
Right.
And every time I write one, I'm just like,
right.
You're going to get a year off to go write.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what I would give for a year off to go write, you know, because I'm never going to have that, you know. So,
well, another thing I wanted to ask you about is, I mean, as an editor and someone who is editing people's poems and seeing their manuscripts, and did you feel like that affects your work in any way? Is it a sort of fertilizing influence to see all this other work, or do you have to sort of draw a circle around your own work and say, I'm going to put it in another sort of area and not think about it in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a crazy example because it's not even a subject I know a lot about, but I think about like how people go to Paris Fashion Week. It's not something I've ever done or anything, but I think about what it would be like to watch all those other people's, you know, what everybody else has designed, and what you think what you've designed is really cool. But then, you know, somebody else has designed something. You're like, oh, look, you've got all that orange clothing. I was thinking more white this season, you know, but whatever everyone else has designed would kind of affect you. And you would go back to the drawing board and you would kind of think differently because you're now in a larger world of what you've seen. And like I have a really good friend who's has been for the last 5 or 6 years, one of the initial readers for the Kingsley Tufts Award. And I was on that judging committee for a few years too. And so you just read tons and tons of poetry, and it starts to make you realize what American poetry looks like. Yeah. And like Red Hen has this big poetry award. I mean, I say big, I mean, it's like $3,000, but I mean, we get about 700 submissions for it. And so I'm reading a lot of what America writes in terms of poetry. And so what it does for me is, first of all, it makes me very clear what I want to publish and what I don't want to publish, what I think I can edit well and what I don't think I can edit well. So like, I really love the books Wave Book publishes, but I'm pretty clear that if Wave Books was hiring an editor, I wouldn't apply for that job because I wouldn't have liked to edit Cloud Corporation, Timothy Donnelly's Cloud Corporation. I've read that book. It was, in fact, it won the Kingsley Tufts when I was one of the final judges, but I don't know if I would have liked to have edited it because it's not something Red Hen would have published. It's just different from what we publish. So that's the kind of thing. For one thing, you have a sense of discernment about what we're going to publish and what's my editorial taste. There's what I read, which is pretty wide, but then there's what we publish. And then an even narrower thing, of course, is what I want to write. Yeah. It becomes clearer to me as I'm reading and thinking what it is that I want to write about. And like with this book, it felt to me, I did a ton of reading, and it felt to me like everything I'd written up until this point, that I was walking in shallow water and that I needed to get in the ocean. And I don't know how this book will be received, but I did get into the ocean with it.
Someone actually asked in the comments about, will we read poems? Maybe this would be a good time if you wanted to read a poem from The Loneliest Girl.
Yeah. And you have a poem picked out too, Adam?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we can both jump in. Adam, you want me to read first and then you're going to read something, or?
Sure. That sounds
fine. Okay. This is the last poem in the book. It's going to come across a tiny bit depressing, but it's going to get better. I will just start off with saying that I've written I think there's one poem in each of my books that in which I imagine myself going to therapy. I've actually never really gone to therapy, even though I grew up completely traumatized in a cult, and should probably think about therapy. But unfortunately, I became a poet, then started depressed, never really could afford the therapy. And so in each of these poems, there's, I think, one in each book, I imagine myself talking to a therapist. So this is me talking to my imaginary therapist. And it's called Stumbling. Are you thinking of killing yourself? I'm not sure. I don't think so. Would you like to go on living? No one wants me to live. No one. Okay, my husband and children want me to live. No one else. Well, now that you mention it, I have 11 friends who want me to live. 11's a good number. So you want to stay alive for the 11 people and your husband, and how many children do you have? Technically 2. Why technically? I have 2 stepchildren who are adults. They may want me to live. But your children and husband definitely do. Absolutely, no doubt. I'd swear on it. Of course, sometimes my husband is annoyed with me, but he still wants me to live. Good to hear. He wouldn't want you to end your life. No, it would bum him out quite a bit. He'd cheer up after a few months, of course. He'd be out dating and he'd find someone easier to deal with. Most women are easier to deal with at first, but then we all turn out to be whiners. Of course. So you are going to live? Probably. Things are bad now, but they might get better. And in the meantime, 2 children, 1 husband who's only sometimes annoyed, and 11 friends, and you have a dog. Yes, a dog, a great dog, Jasper. I'd stay alive for the dog alone. That is good to hear. So what happened? Can we talk about it? We're supposed to listen and act wisely. I did neither. And then a number of people wanted me dead. I see, but they didn't actually come after you to kill you. No, they just wished me dead. What you want is what matters. I don't know what I want anymore. What did you do to annoy these people? To make them wish me dead? I wanted to be a defender. Instead, I was a heckler. What would you like to do? I had this one life, to build the cathedral of the soul, to rebuild mine like a small chapel, a single flower, a bell, a boat, a slip of paper with one perfect poem, a singular line of prose, knees on the ground, planting a row of corn, a trembling ascent of a pyramid, a bird, a grape, a perfectly poured cup of tea. I have my life to work on this single thread. There's unrestrained stupidity and there's grace. In my dreams, I stumble toward grace.
When I read that poem at the end of the book, I thought there's a lot of things in the book that are very powerful and raw. And with this one in particular, I wondered, was it hard to write? Was it hard to write that poem?
Yes, it was. And there were a lot of versions of it. It got shorter and shorter and shorter. It was like 4 times longer in the beginning and got quite a bit shorter. Yeah, so it was kind of a gush of agony in the beginning and then got tighter. And I think it's better tighter.
Yeah. And in your book, you sort of weave together personal and mythical elements. And you use the figure of Medusa as a sort of symbolic, what is it, sort of an alter ego?
Yeah. That's how I thought of it. And I basically think of the idea that both in Greek myth, specifically with Medusa, but then also in the Judeo-Christian myth, that women are supposed to be ashamed. That shame is definitely something that women carry. And, being ashamed for your body, being ashamed if your body is not perfect. And then there's lots of other things you can do that will cause you to have to be more ashamed. And so I tried to work with all those levels of shame that I think we get from the twin pillars of Western civilization. But obviously I worked more with Medusa, but tried to weave in the Bible as well.
Yeah. And it creates an effect of, when you're reading the books, I think that you're sort of wondering what is autobiographical, what is mythical, and it sort of keeps the reader on their toes in a good way. It sort of makes you realize that the personal and the cultural ways of looking at this are sort of complement each other.
Ideally, because I think that we're trained, particularly now. I have been watching this Inventing Anna, and of course, like, you know, that show Inventing Anna, you know, everyone's thinking how much of it is true, and you know, another way of looking at it is how much of it is true of our culture, right? And I think that how much of it is our human story.
Well, one thing that I thought about with my book, and when I'll read a poem from that's also sort of very rooted in personal experience, is, did you think about who would read this poem or who would read your book and what the reactions to it would be, or did you sort of try to not think about that?
I tried to not think about it too much, and as it got closer to publication and I began to think about it, there was definitely a level of anxiety. I mean, over the holiday, I was teaching in Nebraska, and Sandra Beasley was there, and I got to talking with her, and suddenly it sort of started to dawn on me that the book was going to be out, and someone like her, who I don't really know at all, would be reading it, and I was kind of like, what would your reaction would be? And she read a few of the poems, and it started to dawn on me that everybody would have their own different takeaway, as you're saying, and that some people, you can't really make assumptions as to what everyone's going to think.
Yeah. I mean, for me, this is probably the most autobiographical book that I've written. And in earlier books, I never really thought too much about, people I know, what will they think, or people who know some of the things that I'm writing about, well, how will they see it? And I feel like there are some writers who are totally ruthless and don't never care about that. And they're just like, I'll tell everyone's story. And if you don't like it, too bad. And sometimes those people are great writers, and everyone in their families or everyone close to them are sort of horrified by them. And they just say, I have this more important task, right, is to write these books. And I've never really felt like that, certainly. And so I sort of felt like this was a little bit more of a risk to write about things directly and personally. But a lot of the poetry that I like the most is very personal. I mean, I think of writers like John Berryman or Sylvia Plath or Robert Lowell, who in the 50s and 60s were writing these very confessional poems in a way that no one had done before. And my poetry isn't really like that, but at the time, people were sort of shocked, about how much of themselves they put into these poems. And I feel like since then, that seems like a baseline. Like, you have to sort of try to have as much honesty in a poem as they had.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read the book Gabriel by Ed Hirsch, but I think of that as being very raw, very honest, and very close to the skin. And it's one of my favorite books. I think anybody who's ever had a wild child as a kid can relate to a lot of that and feels like it could have been their child. And it's just, he's very honest about not being a perfect parent and about doing his best. And that to me is a book that feels like it transcends itself somehow.
Yeah. And that's the book that's about his son who died, right? Is that Yeah. Okay, well, I can read one of my poems here. This one, there's someone in the chat named Wildwood, Megan Wildwood, and this poem is about my school that I went to, which is called, or is that Wildhood? Okay, Wildhood, I take it back. Well, this poem is about the school that I went to, which was called Wildwood School. This was a school, private school in Los Angeles, and I think it still is. When I was there in the early 80s as a young student, it was quite a small school. Now I think it's more of a big established school. And so my book, The Discarded Life, is a lot about childhood in Los Angeles in the 80s and things that were sort of landmarks and common experiences of that generation, which I guess you would call Generation X. And in this poem, I'm writing about this school, which was really a sort of hippie school. It was like a lot of children of hippies ex-hippies, who went there, and the ethos of the school was very influenced by the 60s, and it was very sort of open, and the teachers were called by their first names, and it was very feminist. And so this is about that sort of culture of the school, and then how it sort of ran up against the reality. The last fumes of the 60s lingered on inside the prefab walls of Wildwood School, where posters urging yes on ERA beamed cheerfully as children bearing names like Bodie, Star, and Rainbow shuffled in to start the day with Union marching songs and chanties praising the endangered whales. If even here we knew about aggression, if boys loved breaking one another's arms in wrestling matches in the asphalt yard, a cast or two per classroom was the norm. And one, the most ingenious, ran a scam convincing me that if I didn't hand my Star Wars action figures over, he would find and kill my parents, which I did for weeks in fear of his omnipotence. The fault was not the teachers, who we knew by first name only. No one ever scrawled it on the tabula rasa of our minds. We must have brought it with us like a lunchbox. Conveniently, I can't remember what I did or said or who the victim was the time the teacher brought us face to face and coaxed me gently to apologize. All I remember is the liberation of realizing that I didn't need to mean it when I said that I was sorry, that I could feel resentment, not remorse, and no one else would know it. What I learned of Hopi customs and Kachina dolls lies like the school itself in disrepair, except for that day's inadvertent lesson. Good is what we have to seem to be, not something anybody ever is. So that poem, like all the poems in the book, is written in a sort of pre-regular meter, of iambic pentameter, with no rhymes. And I like writing in formal verse like that, and I feel like it gives me a sort of container to rely on, a sort of structure, and then I can put things into it. And that one is drawing on some of my early memories of that school. I particularly remember that day of being told that I had to apologize for something and feeling like I hadn't done anything wrong, and then realizing that I didn't have to mean it. I could just say I was sorry. And that was sort of like this new world opening of like the potential of dishonesty, that you could get by with things and just sort of say one thing and mean something else.
I like that, because that's one of the many steps towards growing up, is learning to lie, sadly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also like that because I think that good poems have to turn a corner at some point, and that has that sort of turning a corner. So Adam, we have a question here that is, do either of us find that when we don't plan a project series, so we haven't really planned it out, but that the themes and ideas that obsess us at a given point end up giving a certain coherence to the writing after a period of time? Do you want to take that, Adam?
Sure. I mean, I have never really planned out a book in advance in the sense of saying, I'm going to write this many poems on these subjects, and this is how it's all going to fit together. It's more like I have a certain idea of a range or an area of things that I want to write about, and also an idea of sort of how I want it to sound, what the sort of the rhythm is going to be and the language is going to be. And then I'll sort of start with one or two, and then it'll branch out. So I sort of feel like it's like letting everything settle into a solution, and then you sort of crystallize it all at once. And by all at once, I mean like over a year or two. But you sort of get into the thick of it and start actually doing it. But I feel like I at least couldn't plan out in great detail in advance, because you sort of figure out from the writing what it is that you want to actually write about.
Yeah, my last book that came out in 2014, The Goldilocks Zone, I had decided that I was going to do all this research on inventions that I felt had changed civilization. And the 4 inventions that I decided to research were bridges, condoms, glass, and fireworks. If you're ever taking just some major test somewhere and you have to answer the question of who invented blah, 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 fill in the blank, just start putting in the Chinese, and most of the time you will be right. Because of course, fireworks, the Chinese, and so on. But in each of those, I ended up weaving in a lot of other things, but talked about how those those different inventions had changed culture. And I ended up with a fun book. But this book, I knew I was going to really see if I could get down in the dark with this subject of shaming. And so I guess I was taking a different approach to it than Adam. I did have a subject matter in mind, and I was working on it. Adam, we have another question here, and so I'm going to let you take a run at this too. So the question is, any guidelines to going about understanding what kind of work a particular press, Red Hen or whatever, is interested in? Sometimes you read a number of the books, let's say Nightboat publishes, or Grey Wolf or Copper Canyon or Red Hen or Omnidon. Or Four-Way, and you're still not completely clear if your book would fit in. So I'll just start with you, Adam. When you were choosing where to send your book out to, what helped to guide you? Like, would you have sent your book to Wave Books, since I just mentioned Wave Books? Or would you have decided, no, that's not going to quite work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the only way, and this is true for magazines too, is you have to read around and read a lot of things and figure out which ones you like. And if it's a publishing house you like or a magazine you like, then that is a good sign that it might be one that's going to be interested in your work. I mean, it's not a guarantee, obviously, but if it's one where you read it and you think, oh, this isn't for me, or this is something very different than what I'm interested in, then you know that that's not going to be something for you. Wave Books, which does very sort of avant-garde stuff and a lot of formally experimental stuff, they do some great books, and I've read some great books from there, but I would never think of sending my book there because I would know that wasn't, wasn't for me. And with Red Hen in particular, because you're based in Los Angeles and this is such a Los Angeles book, I thought would be a perfect sort of place to try. But I think it's definitely true that any publishing house or any editor or any poetry magazine is going to publish a range of stuff. It's not going to always be the same kind of thing. So you can't really know in advance for sure what kind of thing they're looking for. And often I think as an editor, maybe you don't necessarily know yourself what you're looking for until you see it. Then when you see something good, you think, oh, this is something I'm interested in. But the one guide would be to go towards places that you like. And also to know, this is something that I do some poetry editing sometimes. And one thing that you always encounter, I'm sure you encounter too, is people who clearly don't know anything about the place they're writing to, and they sort of got it off a list, and they're just sort of sending it to 1,000 places, and you're one of them. That I think almost never works out. It's always best if you can know something about the publishing house or the magazine you're writing to, and be able to say, these are the reasons why I like this place.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is that you've chosen the right press if when your book comes out, it doesn't mean you necessarily will be able to, given people's schedules, but you could see yourself reading with some of the other people whose books are coming out that year. Like Adam's book is coming out this year, and I'm hoping he'll get to do at least one other reading with one of the other poets whose book's coming out at the same time, who's Eamon Grennan, who lives in New York as well. So I've been trying to get something with Eamon and Adam. I've been in touch with him, Adam. We'll see how it goes. But he lives between Ireland and New York. And so basically, to me, they're different kinds of poets, but I do think I could see them reading together and it would be sort of an interesting conversation. And Eamon's poems are much more about the landscape in Ireland and that kind of thing. But I do still think that it would be a very interesting conversation. So I agree with Adam. It's like when poets approach me and say to me, like, I know a lot of the poets that you publish, and I have to say they're my tribe. In 2023, three of the poets that we're publishing, Francesca Bell, Douglas Manuel, and Bryn Sato, are already planning to go on tour together because they feel like their work already complements each other. That makes me feel like I'm choosing well there, right? Because they're part of a tribe already together. So to me, that's exactly what Adam's saying. It's like, if you look at the list and you're like, these are my peeps. This is who I read before I go to sleep at night. This is who I read when I'm writing poetry, is these people. So if you're reading those Nightboat poems and you're like, these are my people. I love all these poets. I love the Night Boat poems. Then maybe that's where you belong. Adam, we've got another question here, which is, have either of us written poems inspired by the pandemic? And also, what situations in life serve to inspire our writing? Do you want to take that, Adam?
Sure. I haven't written anything since about the pandemic. I've not written anything about the pandemic. I know when something big happens, there's inevitably a lot of poetry written about it. I remember after 9/11, there was a lot of 9/11 poetry. I did write about that, a couple of 9/11 poems. So far, I don't know that I feel inspired to write anything specifically about the pandemic. And in a way, I feel like this is going to be a hard experience for people to write about, simply because everyone sort of had the same experience at the same time. Like everyone knows a lot of what this was about. And so to make it new and interesting or surprising is going to be difficult. I mean, obviously some good writers will manage to do that, but it's going to be tricky, I think. And then what was the other question?
Sorry, what situations in life do inspire your writing?
Okay. I feel like it can vary a lot, but I'm often inspired by things from the past, thinking about either my own past or the larger past, and sort of how things change over time. Those are sort of things that often put me in a poetry mood, as opposed to, say, landscape. I almost never really write about landscape, partly because I've always lived in cities, and it's never really been something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about or being exposed to. And so I know that, and that's something that varies a lot by people depending on their experience. I mean, the poet Seamus Heaney wrote great poems about country life and rural life. Other poets, when they write about rural life, I think it's like, oh, more plants, more animals. So it's always about, can you do it well? But that's not something that I probably would ever want to write about.
Yeah, I once was talking with a poet and I was like, do you ever write about landscape at all? And he said, I would be embarrassed if a tree cropped up in one of my poems. I was like, okay, noted. Yeah, I think that in terms of the pandemic, I wrote a whole novel during the pandemic that sort of it started February of 2020 and it swept through, I think, until the Biden election. So it went right through Black Lives Matter and like that. I don't know if anything is going to happen to this novel, but it kept me from madness at some point. But poetry is a different thing. Poetry is a much deeper art for me than prose. So it would have been harder for me to write poetry. Red Hen's publishing a book next year by Arthur Weaver, and he was writing some poetry during the pandemic, but it was not about the pandemic. It was about the protests and George Floyd and like that is going to be in this new book that we're publishing in 2023. So I have been reading, I would say some of the best poems that I've read that came out were not really pandemic related. They were much more related to Black Lives Matter and the protests and that kind of thing. Some very powerful poetry that's come out of that movement. But I will be interested to see what kind of pandemic poetry comes out as well. In terms of what inspires me, I would say that, there's usually this combination of some event in my life that clashes with something big that's happening in the world. And then I keep turning it over and then it becomes something bigger for me to write about. I start working on sort of messy drafts and then continue to work on it. And sometimes I work on a bunch of drafts and then end up throwing it out, when I first moved to LA, it was during the 12-year war in El Salvador. And I was living in a Salvadoran community and I wanted to write a lot about, I spoke, pretty decent Spanish. And so I was talking to all of these people that I was living with and learning all their stories and wanted to write a lot about what was going on. And I went down to El Salvador and wanted to write a lot about that whole story. But in the end, I couldn't because it wasn't really my story. So sometimes you might get excited about something and do some first drafts and then have to toss out the whole thing. But we have ended up at Red Hen, we ended up publishing a lot of other people's stories. Probably the best was by William Archilla, who wrote a great book of poetry about the El Salvadoran War. It's well worth your looking up. Adam, go ahead.
Someone sent a message, which maybe just came to me, about how much does my father's work influence me, and if so, how? Well, Kate mentioned at the beginning that my father's name is Jonathan Kirsch, is a writer. And in fact, his father, Robert Kirsch, was also a writer. So I always grew up in a house where there was writing and books, and it seemed like a very normal thing to do. So that was obviously a big blessing and advantage for me as a writer. I was genetically doomed. The sort of tricky part is to not be overwhelmed by that, and to think about, to sort of be able to figure out, what is it that I have to say that hasn't been said before? What am I going to do differently? And I think that I got a very good balance at home of writing and reading being important and encouraged without it being directed. So I was able to sort of find my own way, and I'm very grateful for that. I think that a lot of the love of reading and a love of writing has to do with when you are exposed to it and what form it takes when you're exposed to it. I mean, if you're surrounded by it, then you can sort of do it naturally. And if you're not, and you don't encounter writing until you're older, in a classroom setting, I think a lot of people first encounter like literary reading in a classroom setting, and it turns them off, and they think, this is a school subject and not something that I want to do on my own time. So learning to do it for fun is a key thing, I think.
Yeah. So there's another question. Because you are an editor, I wonder if you have others edit your work, or do you do it yourself? That's a great question. So I do. I'd love to know what Adam does on this too, because obviously you work with editors. At the Wall Street Journal, I'm sure you have an editor working over you. I am used to editing other people's work, but when I was working on this book, I had what we all refer to as beta readers. So I had a couple people that were looking at the book. But then before I sent it off to Hilda Raz, who is the editor at the University of New Mexico Press, I sent it to sort of my ultimate editor, who is Ilya Kaminsky. And he tore it to shreds, lovingly. He reordered the whole book. And then after I sent it to him, after he had reordered it again. And he dumped a lot of poems. And, there was quite a bit of change that happened with Ilya. He had a somewhat different vision for the direction of the book, and it became much sharper. And actually, when the book just came out, one of my original beta readers was like, oh my gosh, so much has happened to this book since I last saw it. I don't know if everybody does that. I mean, like, I'm friends with Percival Everett, and I get the feeling that Percival Everett needs no editors and just can do everything by himself at this point, in the huge Percival Everett brain. But I don't know, maybe, I don't know. Maybe at some point I will be able to do that myself. But for me, it very much helps to have another set of eyes on my work. Adam, what do you do? I
am very used to being edited as a prose writer, and I don't usually ask for people to read my poetry before I send it to an editor, to a press or a magazine. And it's always tricky with poetry, because on the one hand, it's a kind of writing that you want to reflect you, right? And so I think it's very tempting to feel like if someone else is telling me to do it differently, then it won't be me, it won't be mine, and it will be someone else's vision. But I think that you also have to remember, and this is something that I sometimes tell students, is that it's not just for you, it's to go out into the world and to reach people who don't know you and don't have any connection with you as a person. They're just interested in reading something good. And so you have to sort of figure out how to balance those two things, how to let it go and also know when to insist on the things that really matter the most to you. When it comes to prose writing, I'm very easy to edit. I sort of send it to the editor, and if they want to change things, I say, fine, go ahead. And as an editor myself for a newspaper, I know that when you edit something, it's because you have a particular purpose for it in mind, right? You have a sense of what it's going to be for, who's going to be reading it. That's harder with poetry than with other kinds of writing, I think. But the great example of that, of course, is The Wasteland, where T.S. Eliot wrote this very long poem and sent it to Ezra Pound, and Ezra Pound just sort of took a pen and X'd out whole pages of it and said, "Don't drop this." And when he was done with it, it was like a third the size. And Eliot said, "Okay, I'll publish it this way." And then it became The Wasteland. So a good editor can definitely help.
So there's a follow-up question here. How do you handle if someone's editing redirects your work and you follow their vision or your own? So I'll take a shot at that and I'll see what you're thinking about it, Adam. Okay. Yeah. So I've just finished a nonfiction book, and my agent had me rewrite it 3 or 4 times, I think. And they did have a different vision for it than I had originally had. And I think that, to me, the question is, when you read what the editor or agent is asking you to change, does it feel right to you? And in my case, it was like, I was reading this and I was like, I think you're right. I think this does need to change. It felt to me like this. I felt that she was right, and so I was ready to jump in. So I think that there's a few different reactions you could have. One is I'm lost. I have no idea what to do here, so I'm going to follow you. Possibility number one. Possibility number two is, what you're saying sounds right to me, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. And there's another possibility, which is like, I'm going to hold on to my version of this, and I don't want to change it for you. But I think that for the most part, that is a way to stay unpublished, because unless you have a not very good editor or agent, they are trying to help you reach a wider audience. There's always stories that people will tell, is like, this person was just trying to make my book stupid and I should have stayed with my own vision. There are times like that it happens. So I would say, if someone asks you to do something that you feel is making your book worse, that you should talk with other writers that you know and get find out if they're taking you astray. But most of the time when a writer says to me, my editor or my agent is asking me to rewrite this or that, and I'm listening to what it is they're being asked to do, I think, just do it. That doesn't sound like that big of a deal to me. You're being asked to make a change that doesn't seem that large to me. Adam, what would you say?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that a good editor is trying to help you write the best version of what it is that you want to write. And if you feel like they are helping you to get towards the best version, then you have to sort of take a step back from your egotistical involvement in it. Because I think any writer, when someone says to change something, your very first sort of instinctive reaction is, how dare you tell me to change this? This is my writing, I wrote it. But if you feel like someone is on your side and is working towards the same goals, then it can be very helpful, because you can't really see all the way around a piece of writing that you've done yourself in the same way that you can't, see your own back. You have to sort of trust other people to tell you things that you're not going to be able to tell yourself. As an editor, when you edit for people's poetry for Red Hen, have you ever encountered someone who's refused to take any editing and you had to say, edit it, like make these changes or else?
No, not with poetry. With novels, I have said to someone, like, we need to change the title of your book, or we need to change the ending of your book. And I've had people say, I'd like to think about this a little bit. And then they usually say, I've thought about it and I've talked with my friends, and you're right, this ending needs to change. Because once they think about it, they realize that why the ending doesn't work. I think we have one other question, and maybe you guys will think of one last one, but it looks like the last question here is, how do we balance rejection and criticism? Adam?
Yeah, it's sort of related, I guess. It's the flip side of the editing question is, you have to be able to balance having faith in what you're doing and in your vision with listening to other people's reactions to it. So if you're writing something and no one likes it, then you have to think, is there a good reason for this? Maybe there's something about it that's wrong or that I could do differently. On the other hand, you do hear stories, everyone can tell you the story about like Stephen King's first novel was rejected 50 times and then he got someone to publish it and then he became Stephen King. So sometimes the writer is right and all the editors are wrong, but you don't want to be too wedded to what you're doing. I think you have to have a little bit of flexibility to understand. Sometimes rejection is the right response. Right.
I think that sometimes I do think that women particularly tend to, if something's gotten rejected a couple times, just throw up their hands and say no. And people hate this piece. I'll talk with my grad students all the time, and they'll be like, "Oh, I sent this out, and people hate it." I'm like, "How many times was it rejected?" And they're like, "Twice." I'm like, "Oh, you're not even in the game yet. Until it's been rejected like 10 or 15 times, you really have not put your back into it. Keep going." So I think that you need to 95 times. I like it, Zach. Go for it. You go for it. Keep sending it out. And rejection is just, I think, part of it. And as far as criticism too, I think that we act as if our writing is our child. It's not our child. It's something completely separate from us. It looks like someone's throwing in a very last question, which is, how do we find time to read with all this working and writing and allegedly maybe having some time for fun in New York and Los Angeles? How do we find any time for reading? It's a great last question, because reading is what makes us a creative intellectual person, I think. Reading is sort of like pouring water on the plant. So, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's usually what I would rather be doing. So I think that, if it was reading versus, going to Disneyland, I might prefer reading. So for me, that makes it easy to find time to do it, because it's what I sort of want to do. And I totally agree that if you want to be a writer, you're a reader first. I mean, I think chronologically first in your life, and also any writer will spend more time reading than they spend writing.
I agree with Adam as well. Reading, the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is write in my journal and just kind of think on paper a little bit. And the last thing I do before I go to sleep is read. And the reading I'm doing before I go to sleep is for Kate. Right now I'm reading Percival Everett's book, Trees. So in other words, it's just a book I want to read. And I think that it's very good as if you're a writer and an editor. So if you're like Adam, I hope you're not just reading the stuff you feel you have to read. I hope some of it is just joy reading, because the joy reading is what wakes up your creative mind. And so I just finished the new Jonathan Franzen novel, which I was prepared to hate because it was about, this minister. And that's not one of my favorite subjects, is novels that touch on Christianity. But it was well written. What can I say? It pulled me right in. I think that the reading is what wakes you up and what reminds you what good writing is and inspires you to be a great, fantastic writer yourself. And it's what reminds you why you're in the swim of it all. So
definitely.
Zach, thank you so much for having us with this great group here today. They have so many questions, we could barely keep up with the questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both so much for coming. Thanks for everyone who came out and for who posed all the great questions and for visiting the Writer Center. And we definitely hope that this is not your first. We hope this isn't your first Writer Center visit. We hope it won't be your last. So thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much.
And please buy copies of the books of our guests. I'll put those links back in real quick before we log off for the evening.